We're now 270 days away from the midterms. And right now, a whole lot of Republicans are worried that the president's priorities are going to cost them control of Congress in November. Some of his allies on the Hill think that the president doubling down on the wrong messages is certainly hurting them. For example, this morning, only one day after he told NBC News that a softer touch was needed on immigration, he attended the National Prayer Breakfast and said this.
Things are happening in our country right now, and we have to get the bad ones out. We have to do it. We can't let that happen, and we're being very tough on law and order and crime. If they've killed in another country, they're not going to be the best of citizens, and they're rough people. Remember in the campaign I used to say that their criminals make our criminals look like babies. It's true. These are some of the meanest, most vicious people. They only gave us the worst.
Reminder, that was at the prayer breakfast. Jesus, he was an immigrant. Also reminder that the majority of immigrants arrested in Trump's crackdown do not have criminal records. And polls show that Americans do not like what they are seeing from ICE and Border Patrol on city streets. Also in that interview with NBC News, the president denied that he said the GOP should nationalize elections, even though we heard him say it 2 days ago. But here's what he said yesterday. Watch this.
I didn't say national. I said there are some areas in our country that are extremely corrupt. We can't allow cheating in elections. Now, if we need to put in federal controls as opposed to state controls, remember this, they're really an agent. They're really accumulating the votes for who wins an election. If they can't do it honestly and it can't be done properly and timely, then something else has to happen.
If we need to put in federal controls, in other words, let's nationalize it. Again, the president does not have the power to do this, and our government's defense and national intelligence agencies have said that the 2020 and 2024 elections have never been more secure. Meanwhile, Trump has also shifted his story on why exactly Tulsi Gabbard, their current director of national intelligence, was present at the FBI raid on the Fulton County Election Center. Watch this.
She took a lot of heat 2 days ago because she went in at Pam's insistence. She went in and she looked at votes that want to be checked out from Georgia. They say, why is she doing it? Right, Pam? Why is she doing it? Because Pam wanted her to do it.
But remember, again, Tulsi Gabbard already claimed in a letter to Congress that it was Trump who asked her to be present at the FBI raid. All right, let's get smarter with the help of our leadoff panel this evening. Peter Baker is here, Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. She spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. Peter, you're getting the hard one right off the bat. Just yesterday, our president claimed he did not know why Gabbard was in Georgia, but she told Congress in the last week that the president himself ordered her to be there. What do you make of this?
Well, look, Steph, this is not the first time we've had a contradiction in stories from this administration, either this term or the previous term. You're right to point that out. He says one thing one day and then another thing the next. You're correctly called him on the statement saying he wants to nationalize it. No, he doesn't want to nationalize it. Well, which is it? He's all over the map at times. He says different things depending on the day, depending on the audience, depending on what his calculation of the politics of the moment are. And what's fascinating about this is it's so out of the norm. Not only to have a director of national intelligence there, she's supposed to be in charge of protecting the country against foreign threats, not supposed to be monitoring, local elections in Atlanta, but also that the president himself got on the phone, thanks to Tulsi Gabbard, during the raid, during the search there with the FBI agents and encouraged them to do it. I'm trying to think of what would have been the president's reaction, President Trump's reaction, if President Biden had called the FBI agents who were raiding Mar-a-Lago back a couple of years back, what he would have made of that and what he would have said about the politics of that. This is a president who has made very clear to his agencies, whether it be the the Director of National Intelligence, the Justice Department, of the FBI, that he wants them to find something that backs up the lies that he's been spreading about the previous elections, which are just not true.
Joyce, the New York Times reports that Gabbard used her cell phone to call Trump and addressed FBI agents who had taken part on speakerphone. Are there legal concerns here?
It's difficult to express how abnormal this is simply because it does not happen. It cannot happen. In a normal post-Watergate Justice Department, there's a communications policy that strictly limits which Justice Department employees can talk directly with the White House. And that's usually one person who works in the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General, maybe a couple of other people. It is not line agents executing a search warrant in Atlanta. And those principles are in place to protect the integrity of criminal investigations. You don't want the appearance that a president is directing a criminal case against certain defendants. So, of course, here we have that entirely turned on its head because Donald Trump is openly doing precisely that. And, you asked the right question, Steph. What are the legal implications? This early in a case, there's not really anyone to challenge that sort of setting. Where it would become a problem would be down the road. If there were defendants, if there were an indicted case, they might, for instance, be able to dismiss those charges based on vindictive or selective prosecution based on a president's involvement, which is the kind of motion that we saw filed, for instance, in the prosecution against Jim Comey. Although it didn't get far enough for the judge to decide that motion, it was a very strong one. But suffice it to say, not only is this irregular enough that it could compromise a case, it's irregular for good reasons, because no president should meddle, should interfere in criminal justice, which is supposed to be based on the facts and the law, not presidential whims.
David, could all of this backfire on the president and Republicans?
Well, sure, it could, but I think most likely not directly. In other words, what I'm getting at here is that voters are unhappy with the president because of his stewardship of the economy in their view. He hasn't done a good job. He hasn't delivered on what he campaigned on, and they believe he's insufficiently focused on it. They also now have secondary but very large concerns about interior immigration enforcement tactics and how the administration is going about these mass deportations. Not necessarily that they're happening, but who's targeted and how they're going about it. And, in the first presidency, in Trump's first presidency, Steph, the economy was pretty good and people didn't have a lot of complaints about it. And so there was a lot of space for voters to take a look at Trump's rhetoric and his unusual behavior. And he didn't do half the things he said he was going to do, but the fact that he talked about doing them, that unnerved voters. And it was one of the reasons why Democrats had a really good midterm election in 2018. This time around, the president's being judged on much more normal sort of kitchen table issues. And it's not that all of these other things don't necessarily bother voters, but where races are competitive, where the battle for the House is going to be waged, where the battle for the Senate is going to be waged if the Senate gets more competitive. It's going to be about these normal economic and, in a sense, public safety issues, just because voters, it's not that they're not aware of what's happening, but they only have so much headspace usually in every election. And when the economy and public safety are such primary concerns, they put these other things to the side and they're going to come back to them later.
Peter, the president told Nightly News that he would trust the 2026 election results, even if Republicans lose, but as long as they're fair. Okay. And fair is obviously very, very subjective. And we know this president thinks lots and lots of things are unfair if they're not in his favor. What does this signal to you?
Well, I think it's exactly right. This is the asterisk that means everything, right? Only if they're fair will he accept the elections. And guess who decides whether they're fair? He does. And we know, as you just said, that any election he loses or his side loses, he doesn't think is fair. He just said the other day that Abigail Spanberger cheated to win the Virginia governor's race, even though she won by 15 points. Okay, you're not going to be able to cheat your way to a 15-point win. There's no cheating on the scale that he's talking about anyway. But he can't accept any win by the other side. This goes back even before he was in politics. Back when he was on TV and he lost an Emmy, he said it was rigged. It was cheat. Every time he loses, somebody else has cheated in some way. So what he's doing here is signaling already that he's not going to accept the 2026 election unless Republicans win. And the question is not just what he's going to do after the election, but what he's going to do between now and then to address that. And he's making clear up front in January and February that he is thinking about what to do, that Republicans should take over 15 states. He doesn't say which states, but I think you can imagine they're probably blue states. What does that mean? What kind of actions is he willing to take? He told my colleagues at the New York Times just a couple weeks ago that he regretted not having the military, the National Guard, seize voting machines after the 2020 election. He was told to do that by Mike Flynn. He didn't do it because everybody around him, other than Mike Flynn, basically said you can't really do that. This time he said, I regret not doing it. I should have done that. Well, this is a different turn than it was last time, and he's signaling what he's thinking about.
Joyce, is this even legal, just this idea of sort of these federal controls at the elections? Can he do that?
You know, he really can't. Elections are run by state and local officials. Congress has the ability to pass some legislation, in some cases providing for certain sorts of provisions or guarantees of election integrity. The president doesn't have a real role to play here. The problem is we've seen Donald Trump do exactly this kind of thing repeatedly. The rule of law does not matter to him, and he charges ahead until someone stops him. I think the good news in this context is that there are a variety of groups. There are lawyers like Mark Elias. There are civil rights groups like the Legal Defense Fund, people who are steeped in understanding how elections work and who are ready and willing to litigate these issues. Here it will be important not to wait for Election Day, but where there's some sort of indicia that Trump intends to inject himself inappropriately and illegally, then those lawsuits will have to be launched in advance to prevent that sort of action from taking place. You know, the last thing I'll say, Steph, something I did as a United States attorney for 8 years, and even before when I was a line prosecutor, every U.S. Attorney's Office has the job of protecting day of election operations. You engage with state and local partners beforehand. If there's a problem on the day of the election, if, for instance, say voters can't get into a certain polling place, you might interact with folks to make sure that the elections run fairly. But what you don't do, what you're prohibited from doing, is interfering with the outcome. You don't engage in the vote count. You don't have any role to play in who wins the election. And again, all of those principles are being stood on their head.